Hello, and welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, I must stop my cat from messing with my tripod. You'll have to give me a second. Also, I should probably thank my British rail critics and my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains unspeakably terrifying, and today we are going to discuss the thing I hinted at last week when we talked about the British Rail Modernization Plan. Oh yes, today we will talk about the Beeching Cuts. The Beeching Cuts, which is also known as the Beeching Axe, because apparently people in the United Kingdom are dramatic like that, but I get why you call it that, isn't actually the name of the reports in question. There are two separate reports that are just consecutively considered the Beeching Cuts. One was published in 1963, and it was called the Reshaping of British Railways, and the second was in 1965, and it was called the Development of the Major Railway Trunk Routes. These were written by Dr. Richard Beeching, also known as Baron Beeching, who was a physicist and engineer. What did any of his work experience have to do with running a railroad? Why, none of it! Just so we're clear. Now, Beeching's a very controversial figure because of these reports, but I do want to preface this with the fact that he was doing exactly what he was asked to do. There's a lot of government questionable decision-making going in here, and unfortunately I do have to dig into politics quite a bit. Before I get into the reports themselves, let's discuss the background. The United Kingdom's Conservative Party actually held a majority in the Commons in the general election of the 8th of October 1959. A man by the name of Harold Macmillan was the Prime Minister then. But who's really relevant here isn't necessarily Macmillan, but another gentleman by the name of Ernest Marples. Marples had been previously the Postmaster General, but he was made Transport Minister just 2 weeks later in a cabinet reshuffle. In that position, he had direct access to pretty much everything British Railways did. Marples had a lot of power when it came to the railroad. And this is a problem because it's possible, and I want to stress possible because it's never been directly proven, but it's possible that he may have been intentionally trying to destroy the railroad, or at least make them a lot less of a factor, because of his conflict of interest. See, Marples had a background with a road construction company. When they opened the M1 motorway, he himself said, quote, "This motorway starts a new era in road travel. It is in keeping with the bold scientific age in which we live. It is a powerful weapon to add to our transport system," which is a really weird and kind of threatening way to phrase that. I'm not sure why he went with that wording myself. That's not how I would have put it, but, you know, he really liked cars, is what I'm trying to say. He also had a deep association with a construction company known as Marples Ridgeway, and that became a matter of concern both to the public and politicians. Now, he had resigned as director of the company in 1951, but he only got rid of his shares in it in 1960. Mind you, that was after they were already well into the modernization plan. And that was right after the company had won a contract to build the Hammersmith flyover. It was about that point that questions were starting to be asked about his relationship with the company and how motivated he might be to encourage more road building. However, like I said, I do want to stress that at no point was he found guilty of any wrongdoing. It wasn't like he was formally charged, it was just something that people found a little suspect, as he clearly had some level of motivation, or possibly had some motivation, to build more roads instead of encouraging more railways. In April of 1960, an advisory group was founded, and that was at the request of Macmillan himself, specifically to report on the state of the British Transport Commission. Originally, Marples wanted Sir Edward Smith, who was a retired chief engineer at ICI, or Imperial Chemical Industries, to become a member of the advisory group, but Smith declined the offer but instead recommended Dr. Beeching. And the board that was formed consisted of senior figures in British businesses, but not a single one had previous knowledge or experience with the railway. And this is a big deal to me. I mean, from a business perspective, you might be able to understand like finances and cost-cutting measures and things like that, but railroads require a certain touch. If you put someone in charge of a railway who has no knowledge of how locomotives or trains or anything, operates, then how are they going to really manage it in the grand scheme of things? They could look at a number sheet and say, we should start spending money on this, this, and this. But what if one of those things is really important? You know, like, how would they know? Now, Beeching himself gets a lot of flack for the cuts because, I mean, they're named after him for one. But, like I said, he was only doing what he was asked to do. And even by the time the committee was formed, the government already decided that the railways should be downsized. This was already predetermined. It wasn't like they even really suggested it. The committee was more trying to figure out how best to downsize, not so much making that decision in general. Later, in March of 1961, Marples appointed Beeching as the chairman of the British Transport Commission. At the time, his salary caused a huge amount of controversy. His predecessor, Sir Brian Robertson, was paid £10,000 less than Beeching wound up being paid, as Beeching was awarded the same salary he was being given by ICI. In fact, Beeching was getting paid £14,000 more than the Prime Minister, and 2.5 times higher the salary of any head of a nationalized industry at that time. This already seems a little ridiculous. After all, I understand he's an educated man, and maybe you wanted to treat him fairly based off his previous salaries, but also, he's literally being put in a position to cut costs, and you're paying him an exorbitant amount of money compared to everybody else. I mean, what? The Transport Act of 1962 actually dissolved the British Transport Commission, and it was effectively replaced by the newly established British Railways Board. That took over on the 1st of January 1963, and Dr. Beeching was its first chairman. The new act wound up putting in place measures that would simplify the process of closing railways by removing the need for pros and cons of each case to be heard in detail. Basically, they cut away a lot of the bureaucracy of it. There were some beneficial cases to this, but now the board could close whatever they wanted without having to really justify it. By October of 1964, the Labour government returned under Prime Minister Harold Wilson. And during the election, the Labour government had promised to halt rail closures if elected, but then it didn't, and actually oversaw some of the most controversial ones. And now we can get into the Beeching cuts themselves. The first, the Reshaping of British Railways, was published on the 27th of March, 1963. It starts out by quoting the Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan. First, the industry must be of a size and pattern suited to modern conditions and prospects. In particular, the railway system must be modeled to meet current needs, and the modernization plan must be adapted to this new shape. Under the premise of the report, Beeching wanted to try to run the railways as a profitable business, even though it was government-owned and technically it didn't have to do that. To a certain extent, I would agree with that. It would be nice, whether it's government-owned or not, for the railways to actually be turning a profit. Worst case scenario, they could use the profits to actually improve the railway. But that's not really what wound up happening. Beeching studied traffic flows on all lines, so he could identify the good, the bad, and the indifferent, as he put it. He analyzed the whole of the railway, and showed that the least used 1,762 stations each had annual passenger receipts of less than £2,500 each, and that over half of the 4,300 stations open to passengers in 1960 had receipts less than £10,000. He also analyzed passenger turnout. The least used 50% of stations contributed only 2% of passenger revenue, and that 1/3 of the route miles carried just 1% of passengers. This is all really relevant. From his perspective, he's a numbers guy, he's a physicist, and he just saw places of inefficiency. Simple as that. Why did these lines exist if they were carrying so few people? His calculations took into account alternate routes. He didn't necessarily want to close railways and leave people stranded, but it wasn't always possible. Out of 18,000 miles, or 29,000 kilometers of railway, Beeching himself recommended that at least 6,000 miles, or 9,700 kilometers, which were mostly rural and industrial lines, be closed entirely, and that some of the remaining lines should be kept open only for freight purposes. Passenger service would no longer be provided on those lines. Under this plan, 2,363 stations would close, and that included 435 that were already under threat of being closed. He also felt that freight services should mainly be used for bulk commodities, such as minerals and coal, and that the freight system make use of new containerized handling systems rather than less efficient and slower wagon load traffic, which is something I mentioned last time. And in this element, the Beeching report wasn't entirely wrong. There are some pieces of it that he was correct right on the money on. When it came to changing how freight was operated in the UK on British Railways, yeah, that needed to change. That was an improvement they desperately needed. But closing a lot of these lines, in retrospect, is something that people still argue about. And he wasn't done. On the 16th of February 1965, Beeching introduced a second stage of his reorganization plan, which he called the development of the major railway trunk routes. That report was a little less about closures and more about reorganizing routes in general. He concluded that out of the 7,500 miles or 12,100 kilometers of trunk railway, only 3,000 miles, 4,800 kilometers, should be selected for future development. He felt there was too much duplication on the railway network, and that if they streamlined it, things would run a lot more efficiently and save them money overall. He would leave his position and return to ICI in June of 1965. But both reports had a huge impact on British railways, and it still is seen today with a lot of abandoned lines that no longer have rail traffic. Whether or not the lines are still there at all is a matter of question. It varies. Some are, some aren't. Some of the stations were demolished, some were simply left to rot. But in 1964, line closures peaked at 1,000 miles that year, or 1,600 kilometers. They continued well into the 60s, but they came to a virtual halt by the early 70s. That was still plenty of time for plenty of lines to simply vanish, based purely on Beeching's reports. The closure of the lines actually sparked protests from communities, though, who were furious that they were losing their trains. Whether or not there were that many passengers was irrelevant, people still used them, and they were being literally taken out. There was plan to incorporate new bus traffic instead of the trains, but a lot of places didn't even have that materialize in any way. The buses were not a suitable replacement in some spots, and many rural communities struggle with public transportation even now. It also had further-reaching economic issues due to holiday seasons. A lot of people took the train on their vacations, and holiday and coastal resorts noticed a significant drop in revenue because people just couldn't make their way to the resorts anymore. It wasn't cost-effective for them to drive. Some people couldn't afford a car, or couldn't afford the gas for the car, or there wasn't a good enough bus system to get them there. The trains were what they had used and continued to use, and now they were suddenly just gone, straight up. There were a handful of lines that did manage to be spared from the Axe, even though they were recommended for closure. For example, the lines through the Scottish Highlands, like the Far North line, were left alone. That was due to political pressure from the Highland lobby. And listen, I've seen Highlander, okay? I wouldn't want to mess with those people either. I like my head right where it's at. The Central Wales line also was kept open, and it's suspected this is because it passed through a lot of marginal constituencies. That means there were a lot of swing areas in elections, and no one was willing to risk their seat by angering a group of potential voters. The Tamar Valley line in Devon and Cornwall was also kept open because the local roads, well, they sucked. They were terrible. However, At the same time, the report was only meant to be the first stage of reorganizing the railroads. A lot of lines that weren't recommended on that report were shut down as well, such as the Woodhead line between Manchester and Sheffield in 1981. And the reason why the cuts seemed to stop in the 70s was simply due to public outcry. Every time they closed a line, with very few exceptions, the public's reaction was very angry. They were furious. How dare they get rid of their railways? Whether or not people were necessarily using them, they still liked having the option. And, you know, this is a state-run body. The government now owned them, and the whole point of the government owning them was to keep the railways open, and now they were turning around and closing them. Do you see the disconnect here? That'd be like if Amtrak became a thing and instantly decided, man, there's a lot of rail lines here. I know, let's close all of them. Like, that's not what you're there for. You're supposed to keep the lines open so people have a state-mandated service available to them for travel. It can't survive in the private sector, in your opinion. That's where you're at with it. I'm not sure how true that may be, as some would argue against that, but let's assume that's the case. Okay, let's assume that's the case. Okay, so by making it government-owned, you're keeping the lines open as a service as you need it, because people need it. Some people do need it. Okay, fine. And now you have turned around and closed significant parts of it. If you were just getting rid of redundancies, that'd be one thing, but a lot of these places had no alternatives, so basically they had no way to get from place to place unless they were to go out and suffer the relatively high cost of buying and owning a private car. There were a lot of other flaws with Beeching's reports. For example, it made no recommendations about the handling of land after the lines were closed. British Rail operated a policy of disposing of land that was surplus to requirements, so any materials that were removed during the closures were simply sold off to other industries. It wasn't seen as practical to protect the closed tracked beds, but many redundant structures from closed lines still remain even now, like bridges, and they require maintenance due to legal reasons, yet they supply no benefit to the railways at all because they're not being used. And even though Beeching's report was supposed to increase the profitability of British railways, it really didn't. By 1968, the railways had still not been restored to profitability, or even breaking even. It's hard to say exactly how much money they may have saved by closing those lines, but when the reports were published, British Railways was operating at a loss of £100 million a year. Even if one can say that closing the lines may have saved them some money, it was a drop in the bucket compared to what they were dealing with. The entire situation had nothing to do with the extra lines necessarily. It had to do with the management style, the overall technique of the rail line, the lack of a move forward into containerized freight, the unreliable rolling stock, like the diesels, for example. And in some ways, Beeching's cuts may have actually made the situation worse. Some of the branch lines that were closed had been acting as feeders to the main lines, and the feeder traffic was just gone when those branch lines were closed. Like I mentioned, a lot of places that had their lines closed were supposed to get buses to replace the trains. But even those that did receive their buses kind of hated them. The buses were slower and less convenient than the trains, and a lot of the replacement bus services ran in between the station sites, which meant they lost any potential advantage they would have had over the rail service if they were just running to the same places anyway. The buses that some people did receive were mostly removed within 2 years because people just weren't using them. Many of the lines that had been closed were only running at a very small deficit, making their closure questionable at best. A small deficit is a lot better than the whole of the railway's deficit. It's doubtful that their closure made any significant difference in the grand scheme of things, and again, may have just made the situation worse by angering people. Speaking of angry people, the unions absolutely hated the whole situation, because by closing a bunch of railway stations, suddenly you've lost a bunch of jobs for people. Those railway stations no longer needed to be manned, so a lot of former employees wound up without work. The whole situation wound up being a back and forth over the last few decades, and it started with that Beeching report. He's been kind of a scapegoat over the years, as he was just doing what he was asked to do. He himself said he had no regrets over what happened, saying that his reports were meant to be surgery, not mad chopping.
The railways must be cut down to size.
Dr. Beeching, please stop it!
Hello, Clarice. Tell me about the diesels.
And a lot of the lines that were closed have actually reopened. A few became heritage lines, and a big part of that is a resurgence in popularity when it comes to rail travel over the last couple decades. After the 1970s or so, people started using the trains a lot more for whatever reason. It may have had something to do with fuel prices going up or people just missing riding trains. Additionally, British Rail in the 70s would start to innovate and do things like trying out the APT, which didn't work so well, but it could have, and the HST, which made rail traffic not only a lot more modern and reliable, but fast. The speed element that they gained, I think, kind of made a much bigger difference in the grand scheme of things. That's less of a scary story, unless we're talking about the APT, and more of an actually good story, something genuinely good that happened, so maybe I'll talk about that next time, probably next month, because this is a spooky month, and I can't abort spooky month. Things have to be terrible, horrible, and scary the whole time! And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Sumdude 267, Orange Glass, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Master of None, Josh Johnson, Twin Fox, Dimeblade 17, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Alaric Jaspers, DM Tribal Typhoon, Tommy Rossini, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, and Ty Hammonds Jr. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.